Hi Josh, lovely to have you here. So today I'm joined by Joshua Catlett, who has started a business called Verilo, and it's all around supporting practice owners to realize their exit strategy, and for other newcomers to actually start up their new practices by buying. So Josh is really good at connecting people that want to buy practices with people that want to sell practices. So Josh, do you want to maybe just kind of give us a little bit of a background as to who you are and your journey so far, and kind of why we should listen to you?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, Celia. It's it's really good to be able to, I suppose, get my message out to other physios in the market or clinic owners. Firstly, background on me. So I'm trained as a physio, but don't ask me for advice on back pain. Ask me about accounts and M&A strategy, but not back pain. I set up my first private practice when I was around 22, if my memory serves me correct, and that was in Hertfordshire. I grew that through a combination of acquisitions. We made 7 acquisitions in total, and also organic openings, both satellite clinics and larger practices, until we got to around, I believe it was 33 sites, which was sort of pre-pandemic in 2019. We have shrunk that slightly now, also consolidated because of the pandemic, but that's where we got to. That company was or is Bodyset, formerly Capital Physio. So some people may be familiar with that, others may not. I took a partial exit from that company in 2019, but continued as CEO for a couple of years, and made the decision last summer to hand over the reins to my highly capable number 2, and I've taken on a more I'm still on the board, but it's a more strategic role rather than operational role. So I'm still an investor in that company. I'm still on board, but very much in a reduced capacity. Mm-hmm. During my 10 years of running Bodysets, I have raised around 3 to 4 million in debt and equity funding. As I mentioned, we've made 7 acquisitions. Those acquisitions ranged from sort of 100,000 turnover up to, I believe our largest was just over 1 million turnover. So mm-hmm. I've got a reasonable degree of experience with different sized businesses. Mm-hmm. I decided to set up Verilo for, I guess, three core reasons. Firstly, need. I think there's a massive need in the marketplace to help clinic owners realize an exit. There's, it's a hugely fragmented market. There's a lot of practice owners who have built up really great, successful businesses, but don't know where to start, and are probably quite fearful of the process. There are some options out there. There are some generalist brokers, but they don't really understand the markets, in the same way that a more specialist broker would. Secondly, I've built up a fairly unique skill set, being a physio, having built up a multi-site clinic group, but also having worked with private equity buyers, sellers. I've got a lot of M&A experience. And probably most importantly, some people might say I've got a bit of a hero complex, but I genuinely enjoy helping people, solving problems for them. I'm passionate about supporting people and passing on the knowledge that I've gained. I love deal making. So the combination of that need, my skills, and what gets me up in the morning. That's how I arrived at creating Verilo. Yeah,
I love that. I always talk about with my clients what it's value, joy, and profit. So what adds value, what gives you joy, and what makes profit. So add value to the community. It is a sustainable business for you, and it gives you joy. And if you can get those 3 things right, then there should be success resulting in that. So is there any significance in the name of the business?
A little bit. It's probably more significant to me than others. But on my when I was coming up with the concept of the business, I was actually sat in my parents' garden, I live in Buckinghamshire, and there's a lot of red kites around. So I liked the concept of finding opportunities, soaring, the imagery that a kind of a bird of prey represents. So I thought, great, red kite is as good a name as any. But of course, there's lots of businesses called that. So I thought, well, let's see if we can find a way of integrating that in with a sensible kind of translation. On my mother's side of the family, we have sort of roots in Estonia, which I thought was quite unique. Historically, my great grandfather came over there and escaped some sort of war or atrocity at the time. Came over here with nothing and set up a business. So I wanted to weave in the Estonian connection, my sort of heritage connection with Buckinghamshire. So very loosely, Verilo translate as red kite in Estonian.
Brilliant.
And it is very loosely. Yeah. I must say.
That's
personal
great,
connection,
always,
but but a
it's
little
always
bit
nice to have that story behind it, and that kind of drives your passion as well, which is fantastic. Right, well, let's get chatting about practices. So let's start with how a practice is valued. What are the kind of key components that you take into account? And I suppose there are various different things, like if the practice owns a property, or if it's just goodwill, if they have lots of equipment, their kind of social, their IP and all that kind of thing.
Sure. So my speciality area, or how I help people, is what I would consider the more challenging and less cut and dried element of that valuation. So the goodwill. So I'll try and go through that in a bit of detail and give you some examples, but we'll tackle the simpler ones first. Property, generally property is quite easy. It's done at market value. That's not something that I would personally go and evaluate. I don't have the skill set for that. You're far better off finding a local estate agent or someone that specializes in commercial real estate. But that one is relatively straightforward in terms of evaluation. Equipment, similar nature, but slightly more complex. So stock and perhaps an old plinth sadly isn't really worth much. It will make up part of the goodwill, because if someone's buying the practice as a going concern, they need it, but there will be very little value attributed to that. Where there is value in equipment is if somebody has bought, let's say, a diagnostic ultrasound recently for £10,000-15,000. So an expensive, significant piece of equipment. Generally speaking, most accounting policies depreciate things on your balance sheet over a 5-year period. So if it's 4 years old, it's probably, certainly on your balance sheet, it's going to be worth 20% of what you paid for it. There's potentially a bit of an argument, depending on what that bit of equipment is, as to whether you should use your balance sheet valuation, which you obviously do for sort of tax purposes over a period of time, or whether you can actually go out to market and see what people are prepared to pay for it. So there's probably, there's a way of meeting in the middle, but again, that's relatively easy to value individual items. Goodwill is certainly the one that is most challenging. And where I always start is by trying to figure out what the net profit of the business is. So the general way that buyers are valuing business, our sector businesses in the marketplace at the moment, is through a multiple of EBITDA. EBITDA being earnings before interest, tax, amortization, depreciation. So net profit, essentially. We'll talk about some of the complexities of net profit in different sized businesses shortly, but in principle, you find your net profit number and you apply a multiple. Typically, that multiple will range from 2 at the lower end, all the way up to 5 at the higher end. This is a slightly crude way of establishing the multiple, but without knowledge of any other factors, a business that's turning over £250,000 or less is probably going to have less infrastructure, less staff, and therefore is a bit more risky for a buyer, less contract, it's a bit smaller, therefore it's probably going to command a lower multiple. So I would typically, my starting point is 2 times net profit. At the higher end, if you've got a business that's been established for a long time, is turning over perhaps 800, 900,000, $1 million, it's probably reasonable to expect 4, maybe 5 times EBITDA. So, and then everything else is in between. So that's a very crude mechanism. We don't attribute set value to things like a database or a great website or having an IT system or having employed staff versus self-employed. But if you've got enough of those elements, your multiple will be higher. So there's a couple. You could apply a modifier, which is what I do on my online calculator. And if someone has employed staff versus self-employed, I would add 2.5% to the value. But ultimately, all you're really doing is changing your multiplier with that information, if you like.
Yeah. So it's a really subjective addition to the value, rather than if you have a website and you're getting X amount of hits on the website, it's worth Y.
And I think that the important thing to remember is a business is only worth what somebody's willing to sell it for and someone's willing to buy it for. So all you're really trying to do is establish what is a fair value range. And then really you want to put it out to market and see what people are willing to pay for it. It may well be that if it's in the right geographical location for them and it's got everything on their checklist, then they will be prepared to pay more for it. It may be that it's a fantastic business for you, but someone else might look at it and go, well, I need to change the brands, change the website, change the IT system, therefore it's only worth X to me. So the whole valuation piece is very subjective, but it's a very good base point that you can get to.
Perfect.
I said I'd cover off net profit. It does get quite complex, so I'll try and explain it in the kind of simplest way possible. But when we're looking at net profit, a lot of people overinflate it because of how they pay themselves as directors, particularly the smaller businesses. So if you own a business and as a director you are not working clinically in that business at all, or maybe you're doing a couple of hours a week, generally speaking, your net profit should be fairly accurate. You can rely on that. If, however, you're working 40 hours in the business and you're only paying yourself around a £9,000 or £12,000 salary, which I believe is sort of the tax efficient levels, you will need to allow to add in a like-for-like replacement for you. So I quite often see people that come to me and say, I've got a 200,000 turnover business and my net profit is 120. I can tell you now it's not. So we can do some calculations to kind of work back what the real net profit would be from an outside buyer. I said I've got a very simplistic online calculator tool which does do that adjustment for you. But again, I have seen a lot of people use that and they've perhaps not understood that they pay themselves through dividends rather than payroll. So a useful indicator of valuation, but ultimately, if you're not sure and you're serious about selling your business, then it's definitely worth getting an independent valuation done by a professional.
So it's really for the smaller businesses that do pay themselves that kind of tax efficient salary and then actually pay their salary through dividend. It's actually saying, if I took you out the business and I had to replace someone to do all the work that you had to do, we need to add that cost in and deduct that from the turnover before we look at the profit number.
That's right. So I wrote down an example so I could try and give some figures and give it a bit of context. So if we take a 250,000 turnover business and the owner is reporting a 50,000 net profit, which actually isn't unreasonable. That's probably somewhere in the region I'd expect anyway. If they're paying themselves 10,000, but they're working 40 hours in the business and a main income generator, the calculation would look like 50,000 net profit, add in the director's salary to take it up to 60. From that 60, you then deduct a reasonable replacement cost. I typically use 40. If you're in central London or another sort of major city centre, it might be higher. Outer regions, it might be lower, but that seems like a fair replica cost for a senior physio. And that leaves you with 20,000 net profit. So that's what you would then start with as a net profit to multiply.
Yeah. Okay. So then if you're on the lower end, you're kind of looking at 40,000 as a value of your business, maybe 60,000 as you go up, and depending on all the other things that you throw into the mix, it, adds to the value.
Another good sense check is, broadly speaking, if your net profit figures are around 10 to 20% of turnover, they're probably relatively accurate. If they're 70, 80% of turnover, they're probably not. So again, it depends how you structure the business. There are other things we can take into account, especially with smaller businesses. So it may be that your net profit is coming out much lower, but you pay yourself an overinflated pension for tax reasons. It may be that actually you're putting a very substantial amount of motor expenses through the business. It might be that there are a lot of one-off costs, particularly with the recent pandemic. It might be that you invested £10,000 in, air filtration systems, etc. Again, that can be taken into account. So the methodology that I've outlined is a good starting point, but there are lots of things that can be done that can tweak that valuation, for better or worse.
Yeah, so there are lots of nuances that one needs to take into account. And so just on that, on the pandemic, what has the impact of valuations been? So obviously with the pandemic, some businesses might have had, a really much lower turnover and profit than they had in years before. And if they're at the point where they're selling the business, and if you're taking, say, an average of the last 3 years, how are you getting around the kind of the impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a fair question, and it's one of the again, one of the number one questions I get asked when I'm speaking to potential clients. What I'm saying is generally buyers are happy to pay for what the business is currently doing and historically doing. So if you've got 2 years where you've been making, say, 50,000 net profit, the pandemic year you halved down to 25, but now your management accounts show that you are back to 100% of pre-pandemic trade. We can sell the story that actually the business is now performing as it was, and we can rely on the previous year's figures. What I'm actually finding is statutory accounts for a lot of businesses, depending on when they fall, are showing a lower turnover and lower profit during the pandemic year. But actually, if you extrapolate the management accounts for the last 3 to 6 months, perhaps not the last 3 because we've had the kind of Omicron spike, but if you look at more recent trading, actually, the physio industry appears to be quite buoyant at the moment. Perhaps not in central London, but certainly, certainly the outskirts are doing well. So, yeah, what I always do when I do evaluation is I will extrapolate either a 3 or 6 month period, provided it's reflective of normal trading. Look at historic trading, and I will take an average of those two. And and normally just discount the COVID year because it is an anomaly. And most buyers are very happy with that. I've not had anyone question me on that methodology. And if I was buying a practice, I want to know what it's doing now. As long as there's historical data to back that up. So I don't think that should be a reason to be concerned. The only reason that I would hold off that sale process or be concerned is if there's a continued impact from the pandemic. So let's say you're still 40-50% down and your profit margin is significantly less.
Okay. And so in terms of information, what information do you ask for from the businesses to evaluate? And I suppose linked to that question is, how often is a practice ready to give you the information that you need?
Major bone of contention here.
I think we might have spoken about that.
Yeah. So the core things that I need to value a business or to take it to market is 3 years worth of statutory accounts and 24 months worth of management accounts. If I can give any advice that people are going to take home today, it's make sure that you've got good quality financial information. The amount of times that people talk to me about business potential and how loyal their clients are, all of that's fantastic, but businesses are valued based on the financial information that's presented. That's the first thing that a buyer will look at. They'll dive a lot deeper into other things after, but that financial information is key.
Yeah, and I think a lot of practices, yes, it is a lot of practices that actually collect all their data, give it to the accountant at the end of the year, and then wait for the accountant to give their information back. Maybe 3 months later, they find out if they've made a profit in the year before. Can you maybe just give a little bit of indication of what, when you refer to management accounts? So I think that's something that sometimes people say, well, what do you mean? What is different between management accounts and statutory accounts?
Yeah. So yeah, statutory accounts, as you say, that's where you give all your information over to the accountant, and they produce, I guess, the legal documents that you have to submit at the end of the year. Management accounts are month by month profit and loss figures, which indicate how your business is trading. So typically, what I would want to see in management accounts is the turnover for the previous month, the cost of sale, so what you paid your practitioners, giving and you deduct your cost of sale from your turnover, giving you your gross profit. I would then want to see a breakdown of all of your overheads, totals that would be deducted from your gross profit, and that would leave you with your net profit. So that's what I would want to see. And I would want to see each month, that for each month, for ideally the last 24. We can work around it if there's not that level of detail, but certainly if somebody comes to me and says, I've got statutory accounts from 18 months ago and no other financial information, that's challenging, to say the least.
Yeah.
What I have done is, with people who maybe don't have it in the format that's required, I quite often supply a template and sort of say, look, talk them through it and say, right, this is the information I need. The only slight challenge with that is I do find that people cherry pick what's put into that template. So you do sometimes find that it doesn't quite tally back with previous years. So yeah. But again, this is when having someone doing a independent valuation is useful, because they can make sure that it all makes sense and adds up. So I guess it's just that the accuracy of the management accounts. Go back to you, I guess it would be better practice for practices to have a proper accounting software system that you can kind of look and see everything is reconciled, everything balances up, and so everything is completely up to date. And that's what I recommend my clients to be doing, is actually having like Xero or Sage or QuickBooks and keeping that real time, so that at any given point you can kind of see that you've got your finger on the pulse, really. Well, the nice thing is there's so many systems out there where you can do that. I think most of them do it now, but I use QuickBooks, which connects directly with your bank account. If you spend something, you can, it will tell you, do you want to deduct this? Now, again, I'm not a fan of doing accounts on a cash basis. You should ideally be adding in invoices as they're raised, etc. But even if it is on a cash basis, you can still get a rough idea about how the business is trading. So I can work around a fefew sort of nuances with accounts, but we do have to have financial data, otherwise it's a complete stab in the dark.
Yeah, we've seen because businesses do, so a lot of practices operate on cash basis. And then, so if we're putting dashboards together and we're looking at the what they've serviced in a month, but their accounts are looking at how much money has come in the month, there's that kind of discrepancy, because you might have serviced insurance patients, but the money hasn't come in. So so it is important to understand whether you're working on a cash basis or invoice basis, and making sure that you can reconcile that. But I think best practice is to have an accounting software system. They are brilliant, and they keep you really up to date. I think for the smaller practices, there's nothing wrong with an Excel spreadsheet, but I think once you start getting to a certain size, it's accounting software is absolutely key.
Even if things are done on a cash basis, if you're looking at those numbers over a long enough period of time, generally you can see what that profit is, and you can extrapolate it out. The problem is if you have sort of 2 months where you've not doing it on a cash basis, you can't detect seasonal patterns in trade particularly well, and you'll find that 1 month you might have a big profit, another month it might be a big loss. So if we pick the wrong 3 months to extrapolate, it may not actually be reflective of the business. So if we're doing over 6-12 months, then again, cash basis isn't the end of the world, but always prefer it done properly.
And so in terms of the sale, how does it differ between if we've got sole traders or partnerships and limited companies? What is different about those sale processes?
Yeah, I think that the main difference that I see is if you're a limited company, you would normally sell the shares in the company. So you would sell the whole company as a going concern. You could do an asset and goodwill purchase where a buyer cherry picks or buys certain assets and leaves the kind of shell company with the owner. But it's more typical to do a share purchase agreement. With a sole trader, it's an asset and goodwill purchase. So the valuation methodology is the same. We just got to look at personal accounts and extrapolate it rather than having a slightly nicer set of company accounts. So the valuation methodology is the same. It's just a bit harder to get to the number, and there are less variations in how you can sell the business. But from an owner's point of view, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. It's pretty much the same.
Okay, so you follow the same kind of process.
Follow the same process. Yeah, it's just you've got to. I've sort of dealt with a couple of businesses who are made up of several entities. I've got one that's made up of two limited companies and a sole trader. Now, the big challenge we've had with that particular one is because they all sort of operate together. If you can't present the financial information to prospective buyers from one of those entities, you either have to give it all three entities over to the prospective buyers. Ideally, and this is what I recommend to clients in this situation, is you would either produce a dummy set of accounts which represent a consolidated group, or you would get your accountants to kind of put it into a group or do group accounts. So again, it's all done on a case-by-case basis, but ultimately it doesn't really matter whether you're set up as a partnership, limited company, sole trader. From the sale and valuation point of view, solicitors may well tell me differently when you get to the other end of things, but certainly my element, it doesn't impact too much.
Yeah. Okay. So there's several questions around kind of smaller practices. So if clinic owners are wanting to sell to an associate, what is the best process? So, would it be better for the associate to first become a partner and then buy the owner out? And then also, if the associate is working in the business, and obviously contributing to the success of the business, would that affect the valuation of the business? Because they've kind of been working in the business and then get to a point where they're going to be buying. So they've contributed to the profit. And so would that impact the valuation? And then I suppose questions around, is it better for the person to be employed or self-employed? And I know that there's a whole legal thing about, well, if they're only working in that business and they really look more like an employed person, then they should be employed. But I guess just in terms of the sale process of it. And then just navigating the negotiation between the two parties in terms of value of the business, where obviously the associate buying the business wants to get the best price and the owner selling the business wants to get a best price. And how do you make sure that doesn't disintegrate into a price war?
Yeah.
So lots of questions built into one.
Yeah, I was going to say, so it's quite a lot of questions and a complex question, but it's actually a fairly simple answer. Ultimately, there is no right or wrong way to kind of manage that transaction in terms of whether they should be employed first, work for the business for a period of time. Ultimately, every scenario is different. It shouldn't be a problem if they've worked for the business for 10 years, or if they're a new associate that wants to buy in. The key bit of advice here is independent valuation. So particularly when you have two relatively inexperienced people, when it comes down to kind of valuations, trying to negotiate a price, somebody is always going to feel a little bit hard done by. So I always recommend to get an independent valuation done. And it may be that you split the cost of that. It may be that you both get one done, and then you look at it together and you come to an agreement. But getting that independent valuation up front will prevent a lot of headaches further down the line. In terms of that valuation, whether the associate has been working in the business and contributing to its success or not shouldn't really impact it. Unless they are getting unfairly remunerated for that. So as long as they are working the business and being paid fairly, ultimately, when you're looking at a valuation, you're not looking at who that person is, you're looking at the cost of replacing them. So exactly like we talked about with the business owner, you've almost got to kind of forget that there are particular people in your business, and you've got to say, you've got to see it almost as a financial measure. So if that associate is costing you £40,000, but could be replaced by another associate that costs you £40,000, then you shouldn't really adjust the valuation for that. If, however, that associate is working for 25% of normal market rate because they've been promised to buy the business, then you probably have to take that into account. But I don't often see associates willing to work for 25% of what the rest of the market is willing to pay.
Yeah. Okay. And so obviously getting that valuation, independent valuation, is a good start in terms of that battle of price war. Is there any other, do you recommend anything else in terms of that negotiation? So I'm kind of thinking having a facilitated negotiation, having a facilitated conversation between the parties it can alleviate that that price war, or even just that kind of the difficult things to discuss about the transfer of the business.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it depends what the I guess what the seller is looking for. So generally, what I will do if a clinic owner approaches me and says, Josh, I'm looking to sell the business, the first conversations I have with them are around what their expectation on the valuation is, and whether or not I agree with it. And that may not be detailed, but at least it's sort of making sure we're aligned to start with. And secondly, who is the ideal buyer for that? So if they are adamant that they want an associate to take it over, or if it's a smaller business that may be less attractive to a larger trade buyer, then I think it's a good idea to get that independent valuation and have a negotiated conversation direct with an associate. The slight problem with that is you're almost sort of jumping to the end stage where you've identified your buyer, and you're sitting and you're having that negotiation without any other kind of party showing an interest. What I always encourage, and again, it depends on like I said, the motivation of the owner, but what I try and facilitate is a strategic sale process. So certainly for the slightly larger practices, maybe sort of 250,000 plus turnover, I always think it's a good idea to have a good idea of what you want to achieve up front, put it out to market confidentially, and I would be putting it out externally first, seeing what interest there is and whether those buyers are going to tick your boxes. And it's not just about the price that you achieve. It is it is about continuity of care for clients. It's about the service that's going to be provided in the local community. a lot of clinic owners are, want to make sure their legacy is protected. So there are a lot of other factors to consider, and actually it may be that your associate can't pay the highest price, but is the better option for those other elements. So as I said, certainly on a case-by-case basis, but generally I think it's always good to follow a process with these things, and it will then at least satisfy you as the owner that you've gone out to market and you are getting a fair price for it.
And I guess just kind of on that point of maybe your associate can't afford the best price, have you kind of, what do you typically see in terms of transfer of ownership from owner to associate? Is it usually a once-off payment, like upfront buyout, or have I've seen both. I've seen either that the associate's just paying upfront and buying the shares and that's it, or they do it over a period of time. And then how would you change the valuation depending on the way the practice is purchased?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I think with any buyer, offers that come in, it's very rare that I see offers that come in and they say, I'm going to pay you all of the purchase price on day one. So again, I have this conversation with owners up front that there will be a variety of offers. Some people may offer you more, but over an extended period of time. Others may offer you less, but up front. No different with the associate. And I said it's probably a little harsh of me to assume that an associate may not be the winning bid, because they may be, but generally a company has usually access to larger funds than an individual. What I have seen more commonly with associates is a sort of down payment. So they might buy the business on day one, and they may pay a down payment on day one, and then an element of deferred payment over 3, 4, 5 years. Now, typically with an individual that doesn't have access to the same level of funds, that deferred payment is longer, so over a longer period of time. Other things that I've seen done is buying into the business over time. So it may be that they buy 20% in year one, further 20% in year two, etc., etc. I'm not an accountant or a tax advisor, but there would appear to be some tax advantages to the owner from doing that. If you are selling the entire business, that value is crystallized, or that gain is crystallized on the day you sell the business. So you have a tax liability, a capital gains tax liability, when that's realized. And it may be that it falls into next tax year and you've got 18 months or so to pay it. But if you're being paid over 5 years, then you could actually end up paying more tax than you're getting in terms of consideration. So having an associate buy 20% in year one, 20% in year two, it means that you can more efficiently use your capital gains allowance, assuming you're not using it for other things. So that would appear a sensible way of doing it.
Okay, but bottom line is get tax advice as well in terms of what is the best structure.
I don't give tax advice. I'm not an accountant, but I can certainly give advice on deal structures that have been done and what I would do. But definitely get
perfect. And then what about GDPR? So obviously we had this whole change in the GDPR, and there was a lot of panic back in 2018 was it, when it kind of the change came into play. And so how does GDPR impact transferring information, and obviously in terms of the sale of the business?
Yes, it's an interesting one, and actually, so one I was faced with a few years ago with my second to last or last acquisition. So if you're buying the entire company through a share purchase agreement, you are buying the company. So the data is not transferring hands. The data is remaining with the company you're buying. So there shouldn't be any reason why you need, why GDPR is being breached, because effectively that data hasn't transferred hands. So company share sales are usually quite simple in that nature. when you've got when you're a sole trader, or if you're doing an asset and goodwill sale, you are effectively selling a database, which does become more complicated. Now, again, I will caveat this with I am not a GDPR expert, and I can't give full legal advice around each individual scenario. But generally, what I've done when from a practical point of view, is the outgoing company has done a risk assessment on that data, not risk assessment, an assessment on that data to identify whether there's a justifiable reason to transfer elements of that data. And if they can justify that there's a legitimate reason to transfer that to an incoming group, then I believe it's allowed. What I would do, however, is the sole trader or the selling company should really be notifying those individuals in advance of that data being transferred, that they are transferring it and why it's being transferred. And usually, justifiable reasons are things like continuity of care. And again, it depends what data is being transferred and for what reason. So if you were to just sell a database and the new company was to send out a marketing message to all of them, that would definitely be a big no-no. But if it's done in the right way, then it is achievable.
Okay. Yeah.
But as I said, it is always best to get, it's quite a complicated aspect. So I certainly would, again, take independent advice on the individual scenario at the time. I can help, I can guide, I can certainly point you in the right direction, but it's quite a specialist area.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then in terms of staff, is it better to have them employed or self-employed, from the point of view of being more attractive to the buyer?
I'm going to say employed. Almost every buyer that I speak to prefers employed. It gives them a bit more comfort around the arrangements that are in place. It gives them more comfort that there's a continuity of business going forwards, and that all the staff are suddenly not going to disappear. That's not to say that your business isn't attractive if your staff are self-employed, and there are advantages to self-employed. But from a selling point of view, I'm going to err on employed is generally better.
Yeah. And so I guess leading to that is, if they were self-employed, is there anything that you can do to safeguard therapists leaving and setting up down the road? So I had a scenario years ago where a therapist approached me. She had a relatively small practice, and she'd kind of said that she was selling to her associate, and eventually what actually ended up happening was the associate she didn't go through the process that I would have liked her to go through. And what happened is the associate at the end, just on the last day when she was going to retire, kind of said, "Oh, actually, I'm not going to buy the business," and had organized a room down the road, set up down the road, and she just closed her doors because she was exhausted and she didn't want to carry on anymore. So
I've heard that scenario more than once. So this is why I generally advise going through a process. So if you jump to the final stage and you assume that your associate is the person that's going to buy the practice, you're leaving yourself open to that kind of scenario. So generally, unless you've been sort of planning it for years, you've got a great relationship, generally I advise trying to be a bit more objective about the process, going through a strategic sale process to find the right buyer without any preconceptions as to who that might be. When doing that, you can put in place, or certainly I make sure that we put in place things like non-disclosure agreements, to prevent, an associate, because that associate may be part of that buyer pool, but to prevent individuals that are looking at your business from contacting previous clients. So it does give you an element of protection. Now, if you're adamant that you want to sell to your associate, you could just put a non-disclosure agreement in place, preventing them from contacting patients, etc. They're quite hard to enforce. It can get a bit messy and end in an argument, and so there's no foolproof way of doing it. But generally, I'd be following a strategic process, from day one to avoid, this sort of back of a fag packet kind of negotiation with a person that because it becomes quite emotive. From a selling a practice to a third party point of view, a lot of buyers will have concerns with staff leaving. So what I've done historically is when I've bought businesses, I've offered a small golden handshake to key members of staff on the basis that they get paid it within 6 months, and they get to keep it if they don't leave within the first 18 months or something. Right. So there are things that can be done on the buyer's side to help sort of protect the goodwill in the business, but I guess that's sort of up to the buyer to suggest rather than the seller.
Okay, and then in terms of exiting, I think we've kind of spoken a bit about this. Well, we've spoken about the kind of different ways of selling a business in terms of upfront or deferred, but in terms of the actual owner, what do you typically see as maybe or do they have a small handover period, or in the event that there's a deferred payment over several years, do they remain within the practice? What are the typical exit options for the owner?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure there is a typical, but I guess firstly it depends on who the buyer is. So in the marketplace at the moment, there are a range of buyers. That ranges from an associate to another, to a small local competitor practice, to regional groups, to national groups, market consolidators, which seems to be a bit of a buzzword at the moment, but that sort of investors or individuals or groups who are trying to bring the market together by buying lots of practices and centralizing overheads, which is very sensible. Versus a private equity house. All will have different requirements and different deal structures and terms. Most buyers will expect or require some kind of handover. That handover can be 2 or 3 months, as short as 2 or 3 months. It can be more like 6 months. With the smaller practices where the owner is responsible for a large proportion of the income, it wouldn't surprise me if the handover period requirement was longer, because you want to effectively take over the business, put in your own physio, build up their caseload and transfer that business across, and that takes time. The simple answer is there is no typical. Every scenario is different. And again, what I try and do is, if an owner says to me, Josh, my motivation here is quick exit. As long as I get a fair price, I'm not looking for the highest possible price. And I want I don't mind deferred payment, but I don't want to be on condition. Then I would point them in the direction of buyers that I know strike deals on that basis. There are other, there are even more complex deal structures where an incoming buyer may offer, a trade group may offer the individual shares in the top company. So they might say, your business is worth £100,000. I'm going to give you 50,000 cash, over a 2-year period, and I'm going to offer you £50,000 worth of shares in the joint group. And again, the advice I give there is, if you're considering that, imagine that you've just been paid the full 100,000. Would you reinvest 50,000 in the joint group? And if the answer is yes, great. It's probably a good option. If the answer is no, I would rather diversify that, then they're probably not the buyer for you.
Okay. In terms of future growth opportunities, so let's say, for instance, you have a clinic that maybe has 5 rooms, but it's only utilizing 3, or you have a clinic that's open for a limited period of time. So maybe they're open Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, but they could be open from 7 in the morning until 8 at night, and they could open on the weekends. Is there any impact on the valuation in terms of future opportunity that the buyer is buying?
Limited. So if I can go to a buyer and say, this is a great practice, it's highly profitable, and it's only operating at 60% capacity, so there's room to grow, and and also the recruitment market in the area is reasonable, so you'll be able to find somebody. If I can say all of that, then it helps me sell. Would a buyer actually pay more for potential? No. They want to know what is the business, what has the business done in the past, what is it doing at the moment. That is what they'll pay for. They may look more favorably on a business that has opportunity for growth, but they're not going to suddenly pay 20% more because of it.
Yeah, and that's I guess that leads on to kind of a conversation that I will sometimes have with clients, is that their business is worth a certain amount, or they're operating at a certain capacity, and so they can sell it at the profitability that it is now, or do they want to invest the time and energy and money developing the business over the next 3 or 4 years, and then we can look at the profit and say, well, you'll get the business to this profitability, but actually, was it worth the time, effort, and money? So sometimes I'll look and say, actually, let me just get rid of the business now because I don't want to invest that time, or actually, it's better for me to just stay in the business for the next 5 years and get money out the business and still have the same value of the business. So I guess then it becomes a kind of personal decision around how the practice owners spend their time, energy, and money.
Yeah, I would agree. I think selling a business is a very personal decision, and I speak to a lot of people who are thinking about it but maybe not ready. And what I would say is it's always good to plan well in advance your exit strategy. So there's no point in just kind of going, oh well, I'll deal with this in 2-3 years time, getting to that point and then being frustrated by it, and then doing a fire sale because you just won't get the value for it. It'll be a very stressful experience. Whereas if I think they always say the best time to sell a business is when it's doing well. So if actually you're enjoying it, it's doing well, that's probably when it's worth the most money, and you're going to get the best exit from it. So it is about picking timing, but I wouldn't be I wouldn't always be sort of worried about getting it bigger and bigger and bigger and chasing the kind of golden egg. If you've got if you've got a well-run business that's been you've got sort of 4 or 5 years worth of consistent accounts, and it's trading well at the moment, don't assume that it's suddenly going to triple in value next year just because you've taken another fill up another room. It's probably not.
Yeah. So when would you say the best time to start planning your exit is?
You start your business.
Yeah, exactly. That's my kind of standard answer to that question. In terms of, so we've spoken about kind of evaluating property and whatever, which we leave to the commercial estate, estate specialists and whatever. But what about if you have rented property? So you're selling the goodwill of a business and you've got a lease in place. So 2 questions around this. What is the optimal duration to have left on the lease? And are there any clauses or anything that you have to ensure that aren't going to prohibit you from transferring ownership of that lease?
So on the transfer, it's generally if you're selling the company and the lease is with the company, there shouldn't be any issue in selling the company. There may be there might be some more bespoke leases that do have clauses that do prohibit or make that more difficult. But generally speaking, if the lease is with the company and you're selling the company, you shouldn't even need to get consent to sell the company.
Okay.
If the lease is with you as an individual, or with another company and you're looking to transfer that, there does need to be, or there will most likely be a clause in there that gives you the right to assign and the conditions associated. Now, quite often what I'll see is that there is a right to assign with landlord consent not to be unreasonably withheld. And what that basically means is, provided that the incoming buyer has a good or as good covenant, there's no reason why they could really object to that. But it very much is down to each individual lease and landlord. But yeah, certainly it's something to consider when you're doing an asset and goodwill purchase, or you're transferring a lease that's with you in a personal name. I've had a few major challenges with that myself.
Okay.
Sorry, and the other question?
And then the other question was in terms of duration. What is the optimal duration that's left on the lease? It's kind of like, is it better that the lease is going to run out soon and you've got option to move the business, or is it better that you've got stability for the next 5 years or whatever the case may be?
Generally, if you're selling a business as a going concern, most people want stability. They're looking to buy the business based on what it's doing now. So having an element of stability is good. If you've got a highly unfavorable lease with 25 years left, then that's the downside probably that property is going to be considered a liability. But generally speaking, if you've got sort of 3 to 5 years left, you've got a good relationship with the landlord, and a decent quality lease and a fair market rent, then that's quite a nice purchase for a buyer.
Yeah.
Two things which I've always found help, especially if you're selling a limited company. One, try and negotiate a break clause into it. So and ideally tenant only. So a tenant only break clause, meaning so let's say you've got, or let's say you're just about to renew your lease prior to selling the business. If you renew it for 10 years, negotiate ideally 2 break clauses, one at year 3 and one at year 5, which is tenant only. Now it sort of depends on whether the landlord's going to accept that, but generally that then gives the incoming buyer options. They can keep it for 10 years or they can exit within 3. So that's quite an attractive lease to take on. The second thing, particularly with shorter leases, and again, this is quite a difficult one because a lot of landlords are a bit sneaky with this and try and pull it out. But if you can try and make sure that your lease is inside the Landlord and Tenants Act, it means that when the new owner comes to renew it, they have a lot more security over renewing that lease at fair market value. Right. Most landlords, or a lot of landlords, will ask you to sign a lease outside or ex-act. Which basically means, and you have to actually go to a solicitor and swear this, but if you sign a lease outside the Landlord and Tenants Act, it's much easier for them at the end of that lease period just to say, taking the property back, off you go. So yeah, I'm a big fan of break clauses and trying to get the lease inside Act where possible.
Great, thank you. And then I guess last question around just any practical elements that you assist with during the sale. So there's so many different things that people have to think about, the sale agreement or the transferring ownership of IP, the websites, the social media, managing your team, all this other stuff that comes along with selling a business.
Yeah, so my remit is generally the sale process. So I will start by, doing a bit of a fact find, the valuation element on the business, prepare sales documents, which comprise of a teaser document, so we can get it out to market confidentially, and a full sales pack. I manage I conduct market searches, so look for suitable buyers. And then I manage the expressions of interest that come in from those buyers and introduce them to the seller. I make sure that non-disclosure agreements are in place. So again, it protects the seller. And effectively field questions, although most of the time I pass them on to the seller to complete and then send them back. So I'm heavily involved in that marketing, advertising and discussion phase early on. I then support the seller with negotiations. So once we've got a pool of say 10 or 15 interested parties, we then request offers. So we're sort of narrowing it down all the time to get those offers in. I will then discuss those offers with the seller and the pros and cons of each, and where I think we can potentially go back and negotiate with the parties. And I'll then basically help them negotiate with the interested parties until we've whittled it down to ultimately the successful offer. at that point, my involvement is slightly less, because that's when there's due diligence. So ultimately, it gets handed over to the solicitor then. I have plenty of solicitor contacts. I can I don't get any fees, or I don't have any sort of fee paying relationships with solicitors. But what I can do is advise on what an appropriate cost for the deal size, the size of the deal is. Make introductions to people that have dealt with similar scenarios. So again, professional introductions. I can advise on points on heads of terms. So again, I'm not a solicitor, but I can certainly say, ask your solicitor about this, or I would question that, or having seen other similar deals, you will probably get away with this rather than this. So I can guide them around the negotiations on the heads of terms and tell them what to look out for. My biggest role in the due diligence phase, which is when basically the incoming buyer is bombarding the owner with questions, is effectively being there for support. It's quite a emotionally challenging time, and there's lots of questions, and inevitably the buyer sort of changes one or two of the terms as the process goes along. So I make myself available basically to support people with, is this normal? What can I expect? I join them on meetings if necessary. I don't tend to get too involved in the operational handover, but what I can do is sort of make recommendations on how I've done it in the past. So that's sort of outside of my remit as a broker, but certainly from experience, I can, a bit like the GDPR thing, I can say how I've done it and what might work in their scenario. So my role is very much about negotiating, facilitating, and finding and marketing the business, rather than the operational handover. But I can certainly guide and advise in a more informal basis on that.
Yeah. Okay, good. Is there anything I should have asked you that I haven't?
I don't think so. I think it was a fairly fairly comprehensive set of questions. No, I don't think there's anything that's missing really.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe just give us a bit of an overview of. So you've explained the process that you guide people through, and the parts that you do. How do you package up your services, and how do people access it?
I'll give you my standard prices and services, simply because what I try and do is evaluate things on a case-by-case basis, because every business is different. Generally speaking, so if somebody just wants an independent valuation, I charge £750 for that. Now, the caveat with that is having good quality financial information. If I have to spend 3 weeks going back and forth with the accountants, then that may have to be adjusted. But broadly speaking, it's a fixed fee of £750 for independent valuation, and you get a report with the methodology, the range, and where I think the market value of the business is, which is really helpful, especially when you're having negotiations with an associate. Yeah. On the sales side, generally I charge I charge a fixed fee upfront, which is £1,500, followed by a commission on successful sale, which is typically 8%. Now, depending on the sort of size and nature of the business, sometimes the fixed fee goes up slightly and the commission can go down, and vice versa. So there are some discussions to be had depending on the nature of the sale, but for the vast majority of people, that's the structure. In terms of how to access it, it's fairly simple. Have a conversation with me. I put together a proposal. You have a full read through the T's and C's. Take your time to look at it, and if you're interested, sign up, and we get going. It's quite simple. My general approach is I always try and advise people what's best. Where I like to be different in the market is a lot of generalist brokers will basically give people the information they want to hear. They will tell them their business is worth a fortune. They're sort of very heavy on the upfront fees, and they just want volume. I don't want volume. I want to work with people that are, well, I want to work with people I enjoy working with. At the moment, is me. I'm bringing on a small team this year, but it's still very much sort of working with me. So I want to make sure that I'm working with people that understand the process, know what they're signing up for, that have realistic expectations on valuation. I think it's also really important to make sure people are aware that nobody can guarantee the sale of their business. So no generalist broker, no specialist broker, nobody can guarantee that somebody is going to pay them what they want for their business. All I can guarantee is that working with someone like myself will give you the best possible opportunity of selling the business and achieving the best outcome.
Good. Well, Josh, thank you so much for spending this time with me, answering all those questions. And I think that your service is definitely needed in the sector. I think a lot of business owners get to the end of practicing and kind of start thinking, oh, I want to sell my business, and haven't given it enough thought, and don't really know where to go to sell their business. And and it's a daunting thing. Do you just kind of put an advert in Frontline and say, hey, I want to sell my business, I want out, which a lot of people don't really want to be doing. So I'm really grateful that you are in this space, and I'll look forward to sending clients your way when they need your services. And really thank you for taking time to answer all these questions.
That's okay. And I do try and regularly upload hopefully helpful articles and information on my website. So do feel free to have a look at those articles. And equally, if anyone just wants a bit of advice and support, I'm quite happy to have a chat. There's no pressure to sign up to anything. Just feel free to pick my brains.
Yeah. Okay. So what I'll do, what we'll do is an edit of this. We'll have a slide at the end of the video that will have all your contact details, so your website, your email, and whatever other details you'd like me to put on there, we'll put onto this, so that everybody who's watching this can actually get in touch with you.
Sounds good.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
And you.